This wonderful collection called Look, It's a Woman Writer, edited by Éilís Ní Dhuibhne. It's a fascinating collection of writing by women about their experience as writers. I'm going to keep my mansplaining to a very few remarks, mainly to say welcome. Secondly, to say that for those of you who are with us here this evening, we have some food and drink afterwards, and we'd encourage you all to stay and help celebrate this wonderful book. And then thirdly, to say to those online, thank you very much for joining us. It's our first attempt at a hybrid event, and we're very happy for feedback to know how we're doing, and hopefully it'll work out well for those in the room and those who are joining us online. So with those few words of welcome, I'm delighted to hand over to the chair for this evening, Margaret Ward, and Margaret will take the event forward. Thank you.
Kevin? Oh, fine. Thank you, Kevin. And welcome, everyone. I'm sure you're as pleased as I am to be with people. It's very unusual. I'm still getting used to having walked into a room with people in it, and I have to settle myself down. I'm very grateful to Leah Mills, who sent me a copy of this book over the summer. And when I first saw it, I thought it was a lovely thing to read, but I'm not a writer of fiction or poetry. I was reading it out of interest, but the more I started reading it, the more I felt that I had a lot in common with the writers of this book. So if you indulge me for a minute, I just want to say why I think so many people who aren't writers can also get a lot out of reading this book. That we were on the cusp of the old and the new, that we're all born in the 1950s. We benefited from secondary education, which our foremothers mainly didn't. A lot of us then got grants to go to university. And in my early years, I certainly experienced life as kind of grey and boring and kind of authoritarian in my experience, but books were a way to escape and to imagine oneself a different person and to imagine other destinies. And in the late 60s, things began to change and open up, and student unrest, civil rights movement here. We had the greater freedom of student life. But as a lot of the writers in this book make it very clear, the gender order hadn't changed. We still had the male canon of authors, Sophia in her studies at Queen's, Máiríde in UCD, myself in Queen's as well. I never had a woman who taught me, and when I wanted to research women writers, I was told, women politicians and women activists, I was told that I couldn't do that because women hadn't done anything, so there was no point in doing the research. So we had a lot of barriers to break through. And women's growing realization that you also see in the book, that there were women writers in the past, and it wasn't a very distant past. The Mary Lavins, the Kate O'Briens, etc. And I found that when I was going to secondhand bookshops looking for works by suffragists like Sylvia Pankhurst, I was also looking for books by Kate O'Brien and other writers. So we also had writers like Ruth Carr, who's here tonight, who formed workshops to encourage the new generation, and Ruth has worked selflessly as an editor to promote women writers. And so women of our generation had to reinvent the wheel by, I think at the same time, were determined that it would be the last time this had to be done. So the women writers and feminist publishers like Arlen House, who've been so important, and I think if you look at the book and you see the wonderful history that Alan Hayes of Arlen House has written of feminist publishing in Ireland, and all the book covers that are contained in this book, you can see how much a trail was blazed and a path cleared for the brilliant women writers that we have today. But tonight I'm really delighted to have the opportunity to interview 3 of these trailblazers and to learn more about their lives, the obstacles they faced and the success that they achieved. So we're going alphabetically, and so Ruth and I are going to start our conversation. And Ruth gives a little bit of autobiographical information in her book, that she was born in 1953. She won a poetry award at a very early age in 1969, but the Troubles had started, so she wasn't actually able to go to the event to collect her prize. It had to be posted to her. Many of you might know of Ruth also from a very different side of life, of punk and good vibrations and all of that. But she's also been a steadfast writer, a compiler of books, the fantastic Female Line that came out in 1985, her work with the Word of Mouth Women's Writing Collective, and also editing as part of the team of Field Day. So she's got a huge knowledge of the canon of women writers in Ireland. So we're going to have a chat. And Ruth is somebody I've known for a long time. She's not a stranger. We first met probably in the 1980s, Ruth, around the women's organizations, and particularly around the feminist paper Women's News that we both contributed to. Very different days. The quotation that really struck me in your chapter, Ruth starts off by a quotation, "I may be silent, but I'm writing on the winds." And I think that's a great description to me of Ruth, as it recalls my memories of her, somebody watchful and really observant, quiet, but you know that there was all of this going on inside of her. And living in those turbulent times of the Troubles, of punk music, good vibrations, coming from a working class Belfast background. But you seem to have, what you're saying, this poetry always mattered to you. So how did you manage to integrate all of this in your life at this time?
Well, Margaret, I really take that as a compliment, the way that you have described me. And funnily enough, when I think of you, I would have remembered you as someone quite very thoughtful and very knowledgeable in the days in the 80s, whenever we were both in the, finding our way in the women's movement. I don't think I ever knew what direction I was going to take, probably like many of us, and I just fell into things. Writing was always very, very close to me personally. I felt that it was a very important part of me, and you'll notice that my entry in this great book is very slim, and because it's just about why I write, really. And it just was an urgent, important part for me from whenever I learned to put letters on a page. So it was always there as a resource for me. I did not think of myself as a writer, and I didn't go to university thinking I would be a writer. I was very, very grateful to go to university to get a grant. It was wonderful days for students then. And in the 70s, I think I was a bit like a sponge, really. So many things were happening now that I look back with the benefit of hindsight. The Equal Opportunities Commission, Sex Discrimination Act, Women's Aid was founded, women's movement started. There were lots and lots of things. Imagine adult universal suffrage. We only had it in the 70s. It's hard to believe. So this was a time of opening up to me, even though it was the time of the Troubles. And I remember going to Queen's and seeing on the wall of Sandy Row, Free Noreen, which was a wonderful campaign to free Noreen Winchester, who had been a young woman who had taken a bread knife to her father and killed him after years of incest. And the younger children were growing up and they were going to be next. And she was sentenced quite heavily, but there was a great campaign. And eventually, and quite soon she got a royal pardon, which to me was fantastic. And Women's Aid, meanwhile, people like Cathy Harkin and Avla Kilmurray were setting up Women's Aid in Derry. And it was a time of terrible things, but also breakthroughs, a time of movement, I suppose. But I very much on the fringes. I remember now looking back, I'm so grateful to Professor Cronin, who taught the first years in English language and literature. And he chose to put Janet McNeill on the syllabus. There was barely a woman, as you said, on the syllabus, but she was there because he really admired her work. And so that was how I got to hear of her. And anyone in my year, that's how nobody would have known about her but for that. And the years to come in the 80s, I did an MPhil on her work. And it was in the 80s that I suppose I lost my great involvement in punk music and alternative Ulster, if you like, in that respect, because Terry Hooley and I separated. And I joined the women's movement. And then an opportunity came along. Well, I also won a little award, which meant a lot to me. It reminded me that I was a writer, because I entered in a competition, which ironically was Arlen House and Maxwell House, an annual event, competition which they ran for prose and poetry. And that year it was Beryl Bainbridge was she was judging it, and she chose to give 5 people £100 each instead of choosing to give one. And I was one of the recipients, and I had never seen that amount of money. It was great. But it was also very encouraging. Going down to Dublin and receiving this was like, it was like I'd won, £1 million, because it was something for me. I was a single parent and things weren't great, but this was very special. And also we were asked on that occasion, what do you want to do with this money? And I don't know why I said this, but I said, I want to encourage other women like me who are isolated and want to write. I don't know where that came from, but soon that became a possibility, because when I was working in the Women's Centre in an ACE post, the Northern Ireland Women's Rights Movement, which ran the Women's Centre, wanted to do something to celebrate their 10th anniversary. And Avila Kilmurray again had suggested having a pamphlet with 2 wonderful poets, Maeve McGuckian and Evan Boland. And that would have been a great idea, but I just chirped up and said, I thought it would be wonderful if we could highlight, raise the profile, give visibility to women writers in the North, because so few were published then. Often to be in an anthology, you had to have a book published, and women were having difficulty getting their work published at all, let alone getting a book. So this was agreed, and we got funding from the Equal Opportunities Commission and the Arts Council, and I was given the job as an ACE worker to edit the book. So that was wonderful. And not knowing what to do did not stop me. At that time, it seemed just do it, because you thought of women's press, you thought of Attic House, and you thought, well, I can do it there, we can do it too. So we brought out the female line, and it had a lot of women in it. It just also, the idea was for it to be published authors alongside new authors and emerging writers. So it all sorts of work. Of course, that was before there was internet or mobiles. Everything was advertised on the radio, in the papers, local papers everywhere, contacting groups, word of mouth, everything like that. And it was a wonderful experience for me to receive so much work, which proved how many people were writing, and putting it together and realizing, how generous people are. People like Anne Devlin and Maeve and Jennifer Johnson gave their work freely to go in alongside people who had never had anything published before. And we had also Frances Malloy. I had caught her on the television, being interviewed by Hermione Lee about her wonderful novel, No Mate for the Magpie, which you must read if you ever get a chance. It's one of the best satires about the Troubles here. And so I wrote to her publisher, and she sent me 2 stories, which went into the book, and both of them about abuse. An awful lot of the work was about abuse, or about confinement, or about this trying to find autonomy in some shape or form. There was a lot of work like that. The theme was open. So anyway, that started, and out of that, there was a need for women to get together. So I set up a writing group in the Lidenhall Library, Writing Women, and encouraged others in other areas to do this all over the place. And then out of that, one woman, Anne Zell, well-known poet, American, living in Belfast, rang me up one day, and I didn't really know Anne very well, but she said, I really need to have a poetry group, a women's poetry group to go to, or I'll die. So we set up word of mouth in the Lidenhall Library, who was really supportive and allowed us to sort of meet there monthly for a peppercorn rent. And so then I contacted people I knew, such as Grania Tobin, and people I didn't know but had heard of, Joan Newman, who was a wonderful woman poet here, terrific support, and invited them to come. And we set that group up, and it went on for about 25 years. A wonderful support for all of us, because we were all women who are busy doing things for others, which is a great female role. But this was for our work and to take it seriously. And I have to be very honest and say that I probably wouldn't have sent my work out to be published. But in the 90s, Joan and Kate Newman set up Summer Palace Press, and they asked if I would be their first author. And I was very honored to be there, to bring out my first book with them. But I don't know if I would ever have sent anything out if that hadn't happened. I don't know why that is, my reluctance, but because I do feel committed to writing, but often it doesn't go very far, goes to the wind. But certainly I've had a lot of opportunities like that, especially in my capacity as a facilitator, to bring out community presses, publications, men and women, but particularly to encourage women to write. And I feel it's been a positive thing. It's something that I have felt has been very valuable to do. But I'm delighted that I have also managed to take my own work seriously. I feel that that's a big one up for me as a grown-up. Because
well, is it the affirmation of others in the group, has that given you the confidence, or what has made the difference then? I mean, you're saying that the prize, the first prize from Arlen House and Beryl Bainbridge must have been a fantastic boost, and then getting published by the Newmans. But
I think it's to realize that it's a part of you and to own it. It doesn't have to just be a private part. I think that's what it was, the big step, that it could be something that I wanted to share with others. I think that's what it was about. And also because it was a bit hypocritical when I was encouraging other people to publish their work and I wasn't doing it myself. So I sort of caught myself on there. Margaret?
And then recently you've because I was at that wonderful evening a few years ago in the Lidenhall Library devoted to Mary Ann McCracken, and you read some poems there, and you've had poetry about Mary Ann and Dorothy Wordsworth now published, and devoted sisters, but very talented women in their own right. So could you tell us a bit about what drew you to them?
Well, actually, just to say before that, I think there are many women, the women in this room, there are many writers, and this book it's not the tip of the iceberg, but there are many other women also alongside that aren't in that book that have been invaluable to each other and to the community in putting their voices out. And I'm so glad of that. And it's wonderful to acknowledge that. With Mary Ann and Dorothy, it was just that my eldest daughter is great at organizing holidays, and she invited me to go over to the Lake District and meet her up there. And as a result, we went to Dove Cottage, we went visiting, and actually caught Simon Armitage, who always reads there every year in the church. And just hearing about Dorothy Wordsworth and realizing that she was born within a year of Mary Ann McCracken, and such similarities in these two very different women. They looked completely different. Their approaches were very different. Their writings very different, but they were both inveterate readers and writers. They were inspired by the French Revolution. They were Mary Wollstonecraft, Tom Paine. They were avid campaigners against slavery, both of them, believed in education, believed in the right to education, were very concerned about poverty. And, you know, they were just incredible women. Mm-hmm. And they both also were devoted to an elder brother who, in whose shadow they live now. And in fact, Dorothy and Mary were both instrumental in all of William Wordsworth's writing, because he would have an idea. He had a door put in the back of Dove Cottage, and he would have an idea in his head, think it up, memorize it, go in the door and call to them to come. He had the door there so he didn't have to go through the banality of the kitchen and the steaming, making candles and all the rest of it. So, and he would go up the stairs and call them to drop everything and come up and write down his work for him, because it hurt his hand. And often they were the editors. I mean, it was a combined effort. I think the best lines in Daffodils was by Mary, and it was written down first by Dorothy, and he would consult her journal for ideas. So it was a combined effort. At first, I felt very angry about that. And yes, but knowing it of the time, it was a great opportunity for the women to have an outlet for their creativity. The sad thing is it wasn't recognized. That's the sad thing. But for them, they were creative and they were really, but it was all around the man, which is very annoying. But anyway, so Mary Ann, I just think she's the model citizen for us in Belfast, really. I wish we were all like her. And could I read a poem?
I just going to say, I went on the Mary Ann McCracken tour that Clifton House do on a Friday. I did last week, and it's fabulous. And there's only another few weeks before it stops for the winter. I mean, obviously it'll go on again when the weather improves. But if you haven't been on it, I just recommend that. Yeah.
Well, she is amazing, and they have now actually renewed the Mary Ann Foundation. And I'd like to read, can I read two poems? They're very short. If that's all right, I'm just
great.
going to,
No, we look
but
forward to that. You go.
Yeah. There is going to be a sculpture for Mary Ann McCracken, and I just hope that the sculpture is not like the little picture that we mostly see of her as this wizened little woman with a bonnet on her head, because I hope it's more like the one that Maggie Hambling has done for Mary Wollstonecraft. Not that it's like that, but that it's in honor of. It's something that's trying to capture the spirit of someone rather than a likeness of her. Because I mean, she's someone who will be, you know, fighting for things. And I hope that's what's going to be commemorated in her sculpture. So this is a poem called No Rest. Though curvature had done its best to curb her reach, she stood unbowed. At 88, still walked the quay she'd walked with those long gone. Accosted captains, merchants, passengers, accosts us still to break the slaving chains that shackle limbs and minds. Be more than passengers. Don't rest for less than even. And we're still struggling to do that, aren't we? And the other little one is just for both of them. I'm so glad that they wrote what they wrote, whether even if it was written across the ways and then over the top. But for their dipping pens, this is called. But for their dipping pens. In truth, they both preferred the tongue, the swirl of words in the mouth, their northern twang, the to and fro between friends, well water shared on the road, a sojourner's story, the surge of argument pounding on stubborn rock. That said, without the flow of thought crammed onto paper, We'd never grasped that foxglove feel for things from inside out, that Dorothy way of seeing. Never traced the grit of Marianne working away at the cracks to let the light break through on things kept dark. But for their dipping pens, we could not dip beneath the selfless surface, could not begin to fathom how they held.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you. You can now relax and hear the other two. So I now turn into Sophia Hillan, who I'm amazed that our paths haven't crossed before, because we've both come from Belfast, both been educated by Dominicans, so different schools, both were at Queen's at the same time, and later we've both been at the Institute of Irish Studies at Queen's, but again, not at the same time. So we've been, you know, passing in the night. So I'm delighted that we finally have met up, and I'm actually reading one of her novels at the moment and thoroughly enjoying it. So Sophia has been both somebody who's been at Queen's, who's taught down in Dublin, has experience of schools, universities, Institute of Irish Studies. Again, somebody who won a literary prize fairly early on in your career. Those things that are so important, I think, to, as Ruth says, to affirm women as writers and let them keep going. So, and like I was struck by reading your biography in the book, that like so many of the women, you were inspired by Jo March and Little Women, and we know so many of us are, and imaginative, always writing, relishing the power of literature to transport you to different ways. But you're also a child of the 50s, and then when you go to Queen's, find yourself surrounded by a very male literary world. But you talk about going to Queen's as that heady experience and being there at the time of Heaney, etc. But can you start off by telling us a little bit more about your early experiences of the literary world and the kind of ideas that you started to get as yourself as the individual writer?
Thank you. Like you, I'm astonished that we didn't meet along the way, particularly in the Institute, where we both learned. There were twice weekly seminars, and we both learned that if nobody turned up, you just talk to yourself. So if necessary, you sat in the chairs and pretended to ask yourself questions. And it's terrific training. I was from a reading household. I'll have to move my chair a little bit because I have trouble with my neck. I was from a house that was full of books. My mother had been a teacher of the time when women teachers had to stop as soon as they married. So she was quite determined that we were going to get all the benefit of that. And my father, he wasn't a teacher, he was a chartered accountant, but he was a great reader. So the house was coming down with books, and then books every Christmas, every birthday. And we also had the benefit of television, early television. So when I'm saying I was influenced by Jo March, yes, I read Little Women, but I also saw an early production of it with Andre Melly, George Melly's sister, as Jo March, and she was really good. And people like Alan Bedell as Mr. Darcy. And those things meant a great deal to me, because if I saw something that interested me, I would then chase the book. And it was all very much meshed together. And I thought it would be a simple matter. You simply wrote, rather like Jo March, you sat down, you wrote some stories, you ran off to the post office, you put it, it came back, and it was a check, very simple. And I was quite astonished. I didn't think there was anything to it. And I was quite astonished to find how long it took me to fill an entire page of my Woolworths exercise book. This is definitely going to be longer than I think. And then school, I think I said this in the book, I had a reputation for two things. One of them, which was not good, was being distracted and looking out the window and really leaving the room, being in the room, and then you suddenly hear your name and you didn't know what the question had been. And the other one, which was quite good, was that I had a reputation for being able to write, and that saw me through. But creative writing as such, when I went to Queen's, I went to study. I wanted to read. I wanted to read the things I wanted to read. I didn't want to be doing any subjects that I didn't enjoy anymore. And it was bliss, English and French. It couldn't have been better. And we were fortunate, and Ruth touched on this. She mentioned Professor Cronin, John Cronin, who was very good to so many of us. And Seamus Heaney credited him quite properly with having introduced Irish studies, the study of Anglo-Irish literature, into Queen's, because before that it had been Beowulf to Virginia Woolf. And we certainly got a bit of that, but we also got Irish literature in English, and that meant a huge difference. We also, yes, we had Seamus Heaney, who'd been there when we went, he'd been there for 2 years. We had Edna Longley, who was a young lecturer. And then we were joined by other young staff, Angela Wilcox, Jennifer Fitzgerald, and there were Judith Hutchins, and there was a growing sense that male domination that you're talking about was moving. And those who were there, people like Seamus Heaney, people like John Cronin, were most encouraging of us. And we had Margaret Cardwell, who was editing the Clarendon Dickens. And we had terrific people guiding us, and they did guide us. We were certainly encouraged to write, but I've said in the book as well, the competition around 1968 to 72 was pretty stiff. There's Maeve over there she was writing away, and Paul Muldoon, coming up afterwards, and there's Bernard McGlaverty and Kieran Carson. Well, you really would, I felt I would have had to have some cheek to sit down and say, like, I should do this too. I mean, I might have wanted to, but I wasn't going to do it then. The obvious thing, the traditional thing was that you taught, and that was still what women were advised to do. And as I say, from a teaching family, my mother and many of her siblings and her mother, and they'd all taught, so that yes, I'll do that. And that then takes you further into reading. And I think reading begets writing. And I think to be a writer, you've got first to be a reader and read really widely. And the discipline of teaching something you hadn't particularly thought of, that made you think. When I went to Dublin, I married in the mid-70s, and I went to Dublin. And one real revelation to me was Augustine Martin's Intercert collection, which was exploring English 1. It was full of the most extraordinary short stories, Irish short stories. And one of them was by someone I had met briefly, and that was Michael McGlaverty. A friend, Anne Montague, said, would you like to meet him? And she brought me to meet him. And he then took me under his wing most kindly. And and at that time, then I had begun to write. I'd had work published by Sam Hannah Bell, another great encourager, and by David Marcus. And that's what I was going to do. I'd had various prizes from the BBC, Hennessy, shortlist, that sort of thing, Listowel. But I then moved sideways because Michael McGlaverty gave me access to his papers. Now, you've been through the academic world, and that's something. He'd absolute gold dust, and I thought, well, what am I going to do with this? And I set the creative to one side, and I felt I needed the discipline of a mentor. So that's where the PhD came from. First with Seamus Dean in UCD, and then when my husband's job brought us back north, then John Cronin took me on. It was actually Seamus Heaney who said to me, ask John to do that, and John did. So that's how that came about. But the experience of being at Queen's, and being taught by these people, and people like Seamus Heaney, later on you'd have had to go to Oxford, you'd have had to go to Harvard. We had him right there. And while he expected a great deal of us, they all did. You had to work very, very hard to get an A. But at the bottom you would get a note saying what you got right and what you could do to improve things. So that again is a kind of gold dust, isn't it?
Are those sort of things do you keep or not?
That's fair in the eye. There's an awful lot in that.
So at that stage you were publishing non-fiction. I mean, you're publishing on Michael McClaverty on his papers and writing for an academic audience.
Yes, because I was very fortunate to get a fellowship to the Institute of Irish Studies, and always intending to go back. And my director was R.H. Buchanan, a geographer, Ronnie Buchanan, and he would say to me every now and again, "Well, where's the writing that is you?" And I said, "I'll do this." And then I had little children, and you know, was very important too. There was so much going on that I think I did. I was doing a great deal of academic writing, and then it became more and more involved in the academic life, and then research was gradually during the 90s was becoming paramount. When we were at Queen's, teaching was equally important, and you know, that's what I'm saying. We were really encouraged, but research became paramount, and it was difficult to keep everything going. But yes, the books came out. I wrote on Michael McClaverty, I wrote on Edna O'Brien, I wrote on William Carlton, and increasingly you had to write articles, and you had to produce your refereed articles. You had to produce the requisite number of books. I found that very, very dispiriting.
Well, you're just becoming a kind of factory churning it out by that stage and looking for the journal that has the most kudos, etc. Not necessarily the one that has the biggest audience.
Or even the one that you like.
You
know, or the one that was encouraging you. That I must say that really put me off terribly. And then in the mid to late 90s, I saw that the Royal Society of Literature had a new prize called the V.S. Pritchett Prize. And I thought, I wonder if I could still possibly do this. Because 20 years, not 20 years, the best part of 20 years had passed at this stage. And I put in a story that I had sketched out on a plane coming back from some work to the university. And I wrote it up. And yes, it got a prize. It came second to John Arden, which I thought was all right. I could tolerate that okay. And then David Marcus wrote to me and he said, where's that novel I asked you about in 1981? So that's essentially what happened. He didn't quite say Prison, Where Is That Baby? But he nearly said Prison, Where Is That Baby? And that's how I got back into that. And at that stage, I was beginning to be not disillusioned, that's not the right word, but dissatisfied with the direction that the universities were taking and the policies. So I took early retirement, and then.
Well, since then, I mean, looking at what you've published since retirement, it's been flowing. You've produced a book every 2 years, and have you got other plans? You know, you talked a lot about your 5-year plans.
Well, they were necessary. They were necessary because I'd had that diagnosis when I was so young, and I thought, well, if I can make another 5 years, maybe I can do this, and I can do another 5 years, and still do it. Particularly now, I think yes, I might be lucky to get 5 years. So it becomes important. Yes, I did. And one of the lovely things was twice in my life I tripped over papers. One was a Michael McClaverty handed newspapers, which was a great gift. The second time was a footnote in an edition of Jane Austen's letters. And I discovered that 3 of Jane Austen's nieces had lived, died, and were buried in Donegal. Couldn't believe it. And then the habit of research is such, you pull various threads and things. And that's how Máiríde and Cass came about. And that's after I left university. And
I was inspired that absolutely.
That one wrote
detective.
Oh, it was such fun, I can't tell you. And I didn't have any research assessment exercise. There was nobody saying, is this quite what we want? And is it peer reviewed? No, I could write the book I wanted to write for once. And that was very freeing. And then the novels appeared because I got a contract. And then Arlen Hayes of Arlen House, who really very like David Marcus in that he's a great encourager, and he does bring people along. So he said he would publish my short stories, and they'd been gathering up over those 20 years of long silences. Ruth has written about silence, where she says, you know, I may be silent, but I'm not. That doesn't mean I'm not working on something. So they all came together, and then came the pandemic and the lockdown. So it's a matter again of it's a matter of starting. But I have, because the family, Jane Austen's family in Ireland, have made available to me more documents, more unseen diaries, letters, and portraits, and there's a whole other book there.
Queens would be begging you to come back for that one.
Too bad. No, I don't think they would really.
Do you want to read us something now?
Yes, I would. I was going to read a little bit of a short story that I had been working on. Well, I had been working on before everything shut down, and so I looked at it again today, cut away most of it, and this will be about 3 or 4 minutes, I hope. All we need to know about this is that the young woman in question is losing her sight, and that the young man in this is considerably older than her and is not particularly approved of by her parents. And they're on a boat and they're going to England. I have to hold this up. I hope I'm not blocking anybody. They traveled by boat, stowing his old and idiosyncratic car in the dark hold. Like contraband, Ellie remarked. Well, said Dave, I suppose it is in a way. I hope they don't give us grief at the other side about it. Did you not do the paperwork, said Ellie, about importing or whatever they said you had to? I did what I could, Dave said, and there was an end of it. She didn't know or care why the car had to be imported unless he'd got it from someone over the border. One of his friends was all he said. Stupid border, she said, more to herself than him. Ah, said Dave, you've noticed. But Ellie had lost interest in the car and the border. She could see and sense the wake of the ferry as it pulled away from the shore. It was true, as they'd told her in the hospital, all her other senses would be heightened, even as her sight was compromised. She said, Dave laughed, but she was sure that she could smell the color of the sea. Later on, when he was seasick, she regretted her heightened sense of smell. I begin to be sorry, she said, that we decided against a berth. Pausing only to throw up over the side, he shot back, is that what Mummy and Daddy would do? We don't have that sort of money, Ellie. Let me at least try to get a job first. Or you get one. Did he say that? Or was that just a voice in her head? You should wipe your face, she said. You've got sick all over it. When they rolled off at Liverpool, such a noise the cars made, Ellie had an odd sensation. She was suddenly sure they would be stopped and searched. And they were. 2 plainclothes policemen, here we go, said Dave, Regan, and the other one, flagged them down. Even peripherally, Ellie saw impassive, stony faces. Little was said. It was all gestures, apart from when they were told to get out of the car and their details were taken. But Ellie felt the hostility until she prickled with discomfort, formless anxiety twisting about. She knew what they'd see. A girl, a young woman, early 20s, long untidy hair blown about on deck, blank and unfocused eyes. Then they would turn to the 30-something man beside her, 2 long hair curling about his collar, white seasick face, battered denims. These men would probably think they were on something. And bring them in for that alone. They might see her British passport, his Irish one. They might ask why. Well-brought-up girls, bored with privilege, had aligned themselves with shady characters before this, and innocence had paid in blood. Still there was silence. Ellie tried to smile, but she could feel only a twitching muscle of fear. This must be where they'd be arrested. thrown into jail, maybe never released. Maybe that was what was happening. It had happened more than once to other people. There'd be the what, the something too, depending on where there was an atrocity for which a perpetrator had to be found. It was hard to breathe. She must look guilty of something. And she wondered, would I sign a confession just to be set free? And then in less time than it took to think all this, their passports were handed back and they were directed to their car. Still no word had been spoken. Stunned, shaking, they slid into the seats. There's no need to pull the door off its hinges, said Dave, as he turned round to reverse out of the siding. Then, oh, he said, someone's getting done. Ellie tried to turn, tried to see out of the corner of her eye. Just before the threat of motion sickness compelled her to turn back, she glimpsed two young men, boys really, pulled out, spread-eagled, and a flash of yellow showed a dog, unleashed, leaping into the back seat. I don't think I like this, Ellie said. And she thought, perhaps my mother was right. You're thinking your mother was right, said Dave. About what? I don't know, said Dave. You tell me.
Thank you. That definitely leaves us waiting for more.
The story's called Gossamer, I should have said that.
Gossamer.
Gossamer.
Okay, we're now moving on to Máiríde, Máiríde Woods, who is mainly born in County Antrim, but spent most of your life in North Dublin, and has similar experiences, but a slightly different environment. Again, somebody who talks a lot about her childhood and the importance of literature, being a voracious reader, all the things that we've been talking about and how reading and writing very much go together. And then making the transition from convent school to a very male-dominated university in terms of UCD, and coping with a curriculum that doesn't seem to have changed very much over the decades and wasn't showing the new writers at that time anyway. So, and finding, like many of us, I think, the confidence you've had as a bright girl in school, suddenly having to deal with a very big impersonal environment. And I thought it was very sad when I read that you didn't have the confidence to submit some to the student magazine. But I mean, I empathized with that at the time. And then after that, you kind of kick yourself that when you look at it in hindsight and think you were at least as good as, you know, what was written there, but so many women. But then you get married very early and have a child, but you publish then very quickly after all of that, after you've left university. So tell us a bit about that early time and what was the spur.
I suppose I'm probably a bit older than the others here, in that I went to university in '65, you know, and I went to Dublin in, you know, where my parents' families came from, and you know, it was in some ways going home. There was always sort of an interchange between being in Antrim and Dublin. You know, Antrim was totally rural, and you know, we lived in a very country place. But my father was a teacher. And then Dublin was very urban, and there was this sort of, you know, difference between the two places. We went there every summer, and I went there to university, and I really didn't ever come back, you know. Well, the trouble started, so one tended not to if one had made it out. But I think, you know, I think UCD, to give it its due, did change probably in the 70s, but in the 1960s, one got the impression, now I was a sort of slightly cynical. I had been to a convent, and one of the things that I sort of had learned there was to be very skeptical of all authority, you know, because, you know, they obviously did a lot of, I mean, it was a good convent and they were nice people, but they were working to a system that was there to mold people into the way they wanted. And, you know, it was pretty obvious this is what was going on. And when I went to university then, you got a lot of people working in universities who didn't seem that interested in university or anything much in those days. I mean, there was no sort of call to publish as far as I knew. We never heard about anyone publishing anything. I don't know whether they did or what happened, or whether they're all in sort of journals that are mouldering and never get put on the internet. But I was thinking of my French professor, and I don't think he published. And now I know some of the people in English did, you know, the later people. But they didn't have much interest in students, you know. You all laugh here, but this was, you know, I remember the French people coming into us and saying, next year, half of you won't be here, you know, that you wouldn't get through. That this was, you know, deal with it sort of, you know, it's. So, you know, one didn't expect much. And I had very good English teachers at school. I had really terrific English teachers. And we had done Hopkins and Eliot in poetry, and we had read sort of 3 or 4 novels in A-level English. And, you know, I went to university, and we got these sort of stodgy sort of offcuts of good people, you know. we had Coriolanus in first year, you know, after having done Lear and Macbeth and all these things in school. And then we had Yeats's early poems, and I was sort of thirsting to go for his later poems, which I thought were much better. I didn't want all this Celtic twilight stuff, you know. So it was a disappointment, I suppose, you know. French was a bit better because it was unknown, and in those days you read a lot in the language. We hadn't been corrupted by television to the same extent, you see. So that was, but you know, you lost all the sense of Jo March, and I certainly had no sense that I wanted to write, but I wasn't quite sure of how to get from being me to being a writer. And when I did write things, I wasn't very satisfied with them, and I tended to tear them up, you know. And then there was, as I say, the journals tend to. The St. Stephen's, I think, was the one that UCD produced, and it was very dominated by Group 4. I don't know if the rest of you, who don't come from Dublin and UCD, had ever heard of Group 4. Group 4 was pure English. The rest of us did English with, you know, in my case, French. But, you know, if you were really serious about English, well, you did Group 4. And, you know, and there were a lot of sort of young men with long hair and you know, very soulful expressions, and they seemed to be slightly depressed a lot of the time. So it wasn't a terribly good advertisement for Group 4, but at the same time, we thought this indicated depth and seriousness and the sort of things that, you know, girls perhaps lacked, you know. And, you know, whereas I'd started out thinking that I wouldn't teach, by the time I was involved with in a relationship, I realized that there wasn't really another job that you could do with a family very easily, you know, and that's why I did teach for a short time. But then when I had 4 children, one of them was disabled, and that took a lot of my time. And when I came back to study and that sort of thing in the 1980s and 90s, I suppose, I really didn't want to teach. And I had a few experiences teaching, and I realized that the kids were too wild for me, you know, even with my 4 children. I couldn't quite manage. Like I remember teaching in a place which I perhaps better not name, where the 2 teenage boys almost came to blows, and I felt it was my responsibility to stop them, and they were bigger than me, you know, and I'm not small, but so I felt teaching wasn't really what I wanted to do, and I did a master's in equality studies and social sciences, and I got into social research, which I quite enjoyed, and I ended up working. I managed to set up an advocacy service within the disability area when I worked in the Citizens Information Board, where I ended up, and it was very satisfactory as a job, but it was not good for writing, you know. So I needed the money, obviously, because, you know. Yeah.
So you weren't right. So you have this long period then where you're working, you're bringing up children, and there is no time for writing.
I didn't write very much. I wrote poetry and I wrote stories. The first time I was published was in 1970 something, 1 or 2, just when I'd had my first child, and it was almost sort of accidental, you know. And I'd sent off these poems in my best handwriting because, you know, I didn't have a typewriter. And David Marcus published them in, I think he was in the Irish Press, and I had another poem published in the Irish Times. And I thought, oh, I'm wonderful. You know, this is easy. Anyone can do this. But of course, it wasn't. Getting the second thing published is much, much more difficult. At least that's what I found.
And then you talk about, you know, after this fallow period, when you're not being published, Arlen House and the writing workshops and Evan Bowen, who a lot of the people in the book talk about how important she was as a...
She was like, she was demanding as a teacher, you know, because sometimes people go in to the, I started doing writing workshops and that sort of thing in the 1980s, I think. Now, you know, I need to look up things, but that's, and she was, it was about 1986, I think I met a group of women. We did one that had really worked very well. And it was a sort of one over a year, well, over maybe 6 months. And, you know, we met every month for quite almost a day. And I think that was quite productive. And she was quite demanding, like she didn't sort of tell us we were all wonderful. She sort of said, well, yes, but you need to do this and you need to do that. There was encouragement sort of, you know, sparked with, you know, a bit of criticism as well. Because I think a lot of us didn't know what direction we wanted to go in. And I think that was part of it.
You know, because Ruth talked about the importance of word of mouth and the critique that you got from your peers. After being kind of critiqued by someone like Evan Bowen, did you then feel, okay, now I know that I'm going forward? Or, you know, did she give people the confidence?
She gave good criticism. Like, I mean, it's a hard thing to do because, I mean, I've given classes myself and I know, you know, you get things and you're trying to find the nugget in them that is really, really good. And even where people are not terribly good at writing, you don't want to destroy their confidence because everybody can write to a point, but it's just to go beyond that and to try and get them to sort of edit as well, you know. I suppose that's the big thing. And I think she was good at doing that. And I think also the friends I made there and the people, you know, hearing your work, there's nothing more educational than reading something to people and seeing what sort of response they have. Because you never know whether a story or a poem or whatever you're writing works until you can actually see, you know, the response. And quite often when you read something, you realize, no, this bit isn't working, but this bit is, because I can see from their faces that they're, you know, that they're responding to it. And I think that's what I got out of the you know, the workshops that I did about that time.
And did you publish after that?
I published stories. I won a couple of competitions. I won the Francis McManus, and I had quite a lot of stories published on RT or broadcast on RT in the 1990s, which was very, you know, satisfying. And I won a couple of Hennessy Awards then with stories, and I think in the stories again in the 1990s, you know. But it was quite difficult. I was hoping to get you know, a collection together, but I never actually managed to bring out a collection of short stories. But in the 2000s, a publisher, Astrolabe, published my first book of poetry, which was The Lost Roundness of the World. And that was very nice to have happen, you know. Though I wished it had happened earlier, but it was great that it did happen.
Is there any advice you would give to people who are thinking about getting published or writing, just from the benefit of your experience now?
I think you have to do the publicity. I wouldn't be that keen on publicity. You know, I find it, you know, as I think I mentioned in the essay, Elena Ferrante's idea, you send out the story, the editor takes it, he says it's great, or he says, bring it back, it's got promise, do something with it, and you send it in, and then it goes out to the people and people buy it. That's what I would like. But of course it doesn't happen like that, because it's got, you know, you've got to do tour, you know, go around and try and sell your book and do publicity and, you know, take out little bits and sort of say, you know, try and trick, you know, tempt people into reading it by doing that. And I find I like a bit of it, but I feel that I'm being phony after a while, you know, when you do these sort of things. And I suppose it's partly imposter syndrome, but it's also, it's not really what I want to do, you know? And I mean, the other thing is, of course, that as you get older, you're not such an attractive commodity, because I mean, it is a business of commodities. You know, books are to be sold and commodities. And like the picture with the blonde hair does better than the picture, you know, with the, you know, touched up hair or whatever.
I think it's really interesting because you say towards the end about Elena Ferrante, who, you know, who refuses to say who she is, but we can all project our image of her.
Yeah.
And we've no idea. She could be, you know, a
Yeah.
50-year-old unglamorous woman. We don't know.
Well, given what she writes about, she's
but-
probably our age. You
Yeah,
know?
you know, so but we can also think of her as some young, dynamic Italian woman. You know, we don't know. And I think that's the beauty of it. You know, would there be, would it actually help women's publishing if there was paradoxically, you know, less publicity or less having to conform to the market, I suppose, is what it is.
Well, it's hard to know, because I mean, you are dependent on the market to be published. You know, you know, unless you can publish yourself, and even if you publish yourself, well, you've got to find readers, and you've got to go out there and say, you know, some version of here, stop, I'm wonderful. You know, read this, and I don't know really. I find the publicity thing difficult, but it's, I mean, all the arts have it. You know, I mean, from the rock stars who, you know, go out and have to try and make money out by, you know, getting records and so on done. I don't know how they worked in the past. I haven't done the research. How did Wordsworth make money? Did he keep writing, or did they keep publishing his books? Books were more expensive, I think, relatively in the 19th century than they are now. And I mean, you do sometimes fear that there is a race to the bottom with you know, publishing and this sort of thing. But I don't know. It's not really something that I know that much about. But I do think the publicity does push some people off, and I think as you get older, it puts you off more. Because there is a divide, I think, as well as between men and women, as between, you know, older and younger people. And I mean, people do like to see the you know, what was it, all those programs that are called the thrill of the new or something, you know, that, you know, and the new zeitgeist tends to be much more, you know, in vogue, obviously, than the old one. And I mean, I sometimes feel now that I'm part of a zeitgeist that is gone.
Well, I think Edna O'Brien's a great example of somebody who magnificently transcends all
She
of
does,
that.
yes. But she did establish herself at a state, you know. I think once I didn't realize when I started that you do need to reach a certain point on the ladder before you sort of, you know, relax a bit. Yeah.
Well, Máiríde's going to read something, and then if any of you have questions that you want to put to the panel, have a little think now. So we have time, I think, Kevin, for a bit of discussion after this. So over to you, Máiríde.
I was going to read you a couple of poems. Where is it? Lost my places now. I was going to read you the first one, if I can find it, is After Germaine, which was, I went to a Germaine Greer lecture once, and I suppose all these people were sort of foremothers in a way, and they were sort of interesting. I don't know if I can find it here, but anyway. Where is it? I thought it was written on a piece of paper, but no, it's page 64. Yeah, this is a poem. I went to a Germaine Greer lecture in sometime in the 1990s, I think, in UCD out in Belfield, not the nice UCD that I went to in Earlsford Terrace, where there were lots of things to, you know, compensate for the lecturers, but out in the wilds of Belfield. Anyway, After Germaine, this is a poem about, you know, looking for role models, if you like, and, you know, regretting that you didn't find them earlier. Coming home from the Germaine Greer lecture, buoyed up, yet feeling the heaviness of age, death, and the loss of children, I met an urban fox in her prime, standing assertively in the roadway. "Oh, what are you doing on campus?" I asked her. "Are you researching old crones who live beyond biological imperatives and struggle with twitching time?" She stood before the car, unblinking, disconcertingly perfect in all her foxhood. Before the foxes I'd seen had been cornered, sweating things, blood-sodden or fleeing. Why didn't you appear earlier, I asked. Why did you wait till now, when I've already chosen mate and den, given birth, suckled and lost a generation? If I'd met your solitary pride at 20, you could have been my role model. She turned into the managed shrubbery, following the spoor of her destiny, while we women of the middle time drove along other people's roads into a foxless night. And I wanted to read you another poem that about sort of being between two places, really. And it's called Swan Thoughts, and it's out of the last book I brought out. It draws on the legend of the children of Lir, which I presume everybody knows about. And this is about living in, having been born in one place and, living in another. 4 swans crossed the Kilbarrack Road on a flat February day, no promise of spring. Fionnuala and her brothers, perhaps, exchanging one watery exile for another. How much would they remember after 300 years? A father's weakness, a stepmother's paranoia, loss, fear. Does the line between home and exile blur, making the foreign the familiar, like the red brick bungalow by Dublin Bay, where I've spent most of my life, as much a part of me now as Antrim ever was? Did Fionnuala come to love my Sea of Moyle, her last exile, as painful as the first? Perhaps all that remains is a constant elsewhere of the mind, bags packed for departure through the building of nests, the rearing of young. The wing beat of injustice recurs. I see a bowed old man feeding swans at Broadmeadow. Pictures of stretched wings and necks tell their story to the crooked heart. The lost names echo Garn, Lurgaden, Dalriada, Kintyre. The exile's inner ear resounds to an unrequited place around a new bend. My swans head up Verbena, across Baldoyle Industrial Estate, making for the estuary. Right, thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Máiríde, and thank you all 3 of you. I think they've given you a great cross-section of the book, and I hope whetted your appetite to read more. And before I ask you if you want any questions answered, Sophia's just got something to say about Irish Pen before we forget.
Yes, I meant to say that. Thank you very much. Thank you so much for reminding me of that. I'm a member of the board of Irish Pen. We do Irish Pen, Pen na Heron. We work with other pen centres, English Pen, Scottish Pen, Wales Pen, Cymru, and with Pen International, to support writers and journalists throughout the world who are oppressed, who are imprisoned, or whose writing is whose writing has been silenced for whatever reason. And we do that by highlighting their work, by having sometimes poetry readings, sometimes gatherings, getting translations of them. And even if they can't be heard when they're in prison or they are silenced, their work can be heard out in the world. So if writers among you and anyone who's interested in reading and writing, do think about joining Irish Pen. I think some of my colleagues who are online are going to put a link up on the chat, and the Irish Pen website is very accessible as well. So that's my plea to you tonight. Do consider that, because there are many more writers, men and women, whose work is so well worth hearing and can't be heard because of this, of the terrible tyrannies that we know go on in the world.
Would anyone like to ask a question?
I mean, I know Ruth really well, so I'm surprised that we'd ever discussed this before, but it's about the Noreen case, Winchester case. I was teaching in Lurgan at that time, and one of my colleagues when I said it wasn't great that this verdict had happened for her, astonished me. And I wondered if Ruth thought this reaction would exist now. She said she taught in the prison. She knew Noreen Winchester. She said she thought it was a good thing that Noreen Winchester had been allowed in the prison to expiate her crime, and that she shouldn't have been released. And I wonder if anything's really changed about those attitudes, or whether it would still be possible for a well-meaning person to think such a thing.
Well, thinking about our society and attitudes towards women, I think there is a lot of that sort of feeling still around. Maybe not about that particular crime, but when we think of the abortion issue, for instance, there's an incredible amount of judgment and pressure exerted culturally on women still, as far as I can see. And I don't know if any of you saw a drama called Three Families, which was on a few months ago, and it, I think, gave a very clear picture of the difficulties for different women in different communities to separate what they need to do, which makes common sense and is humane for babies that are not wanted, or for rape situations or whatever. It conflicts completely with the judgment from outside, whether it's coming from the church or coming from doctors. And it seems to me, even the fact that we have been given some semblance of parity with the UK in terms of the changes in the abortion law now, but there is no infrastructure put in place for that to be practiced. And I think that's a token of the same sort of attitude, if you can translate it that way.
I think that with the Sarah Everard case and the Me Too movement, a lot of other things that have happened, and the Repeal the Eighth movement in the South, you know, that you're talking about one particular kind of attitude, and I think there's some incredible narrow-mindedness and church-dominated throughout churches, particularly here in the North. But there is so much more understanding, and there has been so much uncovered about the horrific nature of violence against women that people maybe weren't aware of before, and that, you know, that it doesn't happen in stereotypical ways. It happens to anyone, like a young woman like Sarah Everard walking home. So I think those things, there are these moments that really kind of hopefully help to shift attitudes. And what's particularly happening is what's happening with the Metropolitan Police. I mean, that image of what happened when women went out to protest the first time, and the Metropolitan Police launched themselves on it, and that picture of that woman lying on the ground with their hands behind her, being treated by the police, that kind of institutional misogyny is now being looked at in a very wide case. And you know, maybe we see it then within the kinds of institution that you're talking about, Gráinne, as well. And you know, it's certainly, I think, been aired more, and it should have been done obviously decades ago. I know Éilís Ní Dhuibhne, who's the editor of this splendid book, wants to say a few words. So can I invite you to come forward, Éilís?
Well, I want to say I have a few comments and thank yous, and also a question for Ruth. I hope I'm not putting you on the spot with the question, but I'll start with the comments. And basically, thank you so much to Kevin Conmy and Siobhan Campbell for so generously hosting this event. They have been so important for supporting Irish writing over their years here. And this it's just such a lovely occasion. I mean, it's the first live event where I've actually, as editor of the book, seen face to face the contributors, some of the contributors, though we've had many Zoom events and launches and whatever. So thank you to everybody, and to Niamh Kelpie and to Georgia Knapp here, who did so much to arrange the whole thing. So thank you. And I think, I mean, the book, there are 21 essays by 21 writers who were born around the 1950s, like me, and otherwise have in common that they're female. It's called Literary Feminisms, but what surprised me about the essays was that they were all so different. I mean, they're all these personal stories that have a certain amount in common because of the historical context, and I think we got that here tonight as well. And on the other hand, there's this wonderful variousness in the stories of how they started writing, how they went on writing, how they got published, and how they've all continued writing. Because, I mean, some people have said some rather gloomy things about age, but I have to say that we are late middle age, according to Maureen Gaffney, whose great book on my precious and beautiful life, or whatever I've been reading, that we're now categorized as, you're not really old till you have to hit 80 before you're even allowed to call yourself elderly these days. So, and I think that's maybe how we feel. But so all these women started writing in the 70s, 80s, and are still doing it. I think that's the wonderful thing. And yeah, I think that's really what I want to say. The variousness, the kind of intersection of history and the personal is coming through the book and through the talks here. I knew this was going to be a wonderful evening. I knew we were going to hear all kinds of really interesting stories from the contributors, because we always do. And what people say, there's some overlap with what they write in the essays, but there is so much more. So the richness of these stories is just incredible. And I think also Ruth said there are, you know, people even in this room who should be in the book. There are just one writers from the 50s here. I keep meaning to sit down and figure out how many women writers are there from that kind of school or generation, but I haven't got around to doing it yet. But I'm sure, yeah, is it 50? Is it 60 on the island? Quite a few, certainly. And there's room for another book of this kind, because I think although we're all busy writing poems and stories and novels and plays, that the personal stories are just so interesting and so great to have. So so thank you, Margaret Ward, for hosting it, for chairing it and asking such great questions, and Ruth, Sophia and Máiríde for giving such really lovely answers. Now, my question, Ruth, what is the best line in the Daffodils that Dorothy Wordsworth wrote? Yeah, that's what I thought. Good. Yes, agreed. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah, I've been to Dove Cottage as well and read a journeys. Yeah. I think that's a lovely way to end the evening. Thank you, Éilís. Kim, do you want to say anything else?
Thank you very much. No, just to say congratulations and thank you to Margaret and Ruth and Sophia and Máiríde. That was a fascinating evening. I know I think at the front end, I said maybe half hour, 40 minutes. We've gone well over that, but it's been fascinating. And I hope everybody online and everybody in the room has enjoyed that. It's a great book for those of you who haven't got it. It's for sale in the room, and it can be bought online as well. So I would encourage people to acquire it. It makes a great Christmas present as well. And really, it just remains for me to say thank you for coming, and please join us for a drink and some food and conversation. And thank you so much for coming.